Hello and welcome to this edition of the Vermont Report on Palestine-Israel. I'm Mark Hage. We'll open the program today by looking back a little more than a year to the first month of Israel's savage air campaign against the Gaza Strip. Our report will examine just 17 airstrikes of more than 12,000 that occurred during that first month of Israel's genocidal war. This report comes to us from Air Wars, an organization based in London, and was produced in collaboration with Sky News in France. This is the largest public analysis of data to date on Israel strike footage. Footage that the Israeli military posted in voluminous amounts on social media. Now, Air Wars has been researching and producing reports of this kind for more than 10 years across 8 different conflict zones using the same open source methodology. But when it released this report in early December, it said, by almost any metric, the first month of the Israeli campaign in Gaza is incomparable with any 21st century air campaign. It is by far the most intense, destructive, and fatal for civilians that Air Wars has ever documented. The name of this report, like the video you're about to see, is titled "The Killings They Tweeted." Here now is Air Wars.
In the past year, Israel has released more videos of airstrikes than perhaps any military in the history of warfare. More than 1,300 grainy clips of strikes in Gaza have been posted on social media. They show only a fraction of the tens of thousands of strikes conducted by the Israeli military since October 7th. They are those that the military chose to release, the ones they wanted the world to see, but who was actually killed. In the largest public analysis of military strike footage, Air Wars, in collaboration with Sky News, reviewed hundreds of clips released by the Israeli military from the first month of the war. We identified nearly 20 strikes in which civilians were harmed that the Israeli military itself published footage of. In these strikes alone, Air Wars found that more than 400 civilians were reportedly killed. In response to the brutal Hamas-led October 7th assault and the kidnapping of hundreds of people, Israel launched one of the largest military campaigns in modern history. Within a month, the Israeli Defense Forces declared it had hit more than 12,000 targets, reportedly killing more than 7,000 Palestinians. Almost every day for the first month of the war, the Israeli Air Force posted footage of strikes on social media, including X, formerly known as Twitter. The videos are typically black and white, with multiple strikes on different locations compiled into single videos with generalized captions about targeting Hamas. There are rarely any victims visible and few locational details published. Through a process called geolocation, we compared more than 600 clips from the first month with satellite imagery and reports from Gaza of civilians killed or injured. Despite most of these clips being too low resolution or including too few details to locate, we found the exact locations of 72 strikes. In 17 of these, the footage matched the exact location where Air Wars had documented reports of civilians killed or injured. In these strikes, at least 448 civilians were reportedly killed, including 204 children and 123 women. The Israeli army rejected the findings of this investigation, stating that many of the accusations and claims were baseless and constitute speculation. It did not specify which accusations it was referring to. The videos were released by the Israeli military to portray the bombing campaign as precise and targeted, designed to minimize civilian casualties. This investigation offers a different story. By detailing the full human cost of just 3 strikes, we uncover not precision, but devastating levels of civilian harm. At 6:22 p.m. on October 9, 2023, The Israeli Defense Forces tweeted this video alongside 15 other strikes. The caption made no specific mention of this mosque, stating that planes were striking throughout Gaza and wreaking havoc on Hamas terrorists. But when and where was this strike? And who was killed? 7 hours before the tweet, the Al-Susi Mosque in Al-Shati refugee camp was destroyed. A photographer who arrived at the scene shortly after told Air Wars he saw dead and injured Palestinians being brought out from nearby homes and shops. Some had been queuing at a water fountain when the bomb landed. At least 10 civilians were reportedly killed, including an 84-year-old woman and a mother and her infant son. While religious sites have special protections under international humanitarian law, residents said there was no warning before the attack. We verified the strike's location by comparing ground footage with satellite imagery. Among the debris, the distinctive domes found on the roof can be seen in satellite imagery and the IDF footage. Before the war, the square was a popular meeting place in the refugee camp, hosting markets, volleyball games, and screenings of World Cup matches. In this video, taken 3 years ago, children gathered outside the mosque after Friday prayers as a charity staged a performance to help those exposed to trauma through war. The Israeli military did not respond to questions about this specific strike, but highlighted Hamas's history of operating from civilian neighborhoods. The IDF directs its strikes towards military targets and military operatives only, and does not target civilian objects and civilians, a statement read. Whilst militaries have published airstrike footage in the past, it has never been on this scale. So why has the Israeli military chosen to release so many videos?
The first narrative they want to push out towards the domestic audience is that we're winning. After 11 months of hardship and war that cost a lot of money, cost the lives of a lot of Israeli soldiers, we're winning. Number two message is a message of deterrence, which is aimed at Hamas, Iran, Hezbollah, others in the axis of resistance to say, if you attack us, this is what will happen to you. The problem with that is, though, that these messages are sent broadly, and so I think the most important sort of audience globally now is the international community, who view this war increasingly critically in terms of war crimes being committed, some calling it a genocide. So in this context, Israel should show restraint, should show that when they strike, they do so in a targeted fashion. All of the footage being pushed out by the IDF suggests the opposite.
On October 27th, the IDF posted a compilation of 10 airstrikes with a caption stating 250 Hamas targets had been struck that day. In the first clip, the subtitle, "Strike of a Hamas Terror Tunnel," accompanies a series of explosions. We verified this building as the Al-Taj Tower, a 7-story residential block in an affluent neighborhood of Gaza City.
حينما قالوا لي أنني سأموت شعرت بالفرح لحظة تحركت عقيدة الحياة في.
This is Hala Saleh, reading a passage she posted on her Instagram. Her passions were her 4 children and reading, and she dreamed of opening her own bookshop in Gaza. With days of intense bombing, the family, including Hala's daughters, Maymana and Habiba, fled their home to shelter with relatives in Al-Taj Tower. On the day of the strike, 18 of the family members were in one apartment. Hala and Maymana sharing a bed, trying to sleep after a night of strikes, while Habiba was curled up on her phone on the balcony. When the tower was bombed, Hala's brother Hisham was in southern Gaza. After several failed calls to Hala's cell phone and a day searching in hospitals, he travelled to the tower block.
مربع كامل صعب 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 صعب. كمية البيوت اللي واقعة فوق سكانها، يعني البرج واقع. اكتشف انه كل واحد بدور على أهله، يعني كل عيلة بتدور على سكانها واجتهاد شخصي من الناس.
Eventually, Hisham found Hala's body among the rubble.
رفعوا كمان مرة، وبعديها حاولنا نطلع هالة وميمنة. طبعا أنا في الأول كنت شايف رجلين هالة وفي مسافة إني أنا أقدر أفوت لها، بس إني صعب أقدر أسحبها أو أطلعها من السقف اللي واقع عليها. قعدنا نحاول نشيل الرمل وأنا كنت شبه.
In total, 15 members of Hala's family were killed. After her death, an artist's drawing of Hala with 4 small birds perched on her was circulated on Instagram. Air Wars identified at least 101 civilians killed in this strike, including 44 children and 37 women. The Israeli military gave a blanket evacuation order on October 13th to more than 1 million residents of Gaza City, but many had nowhere to go. In previous conflicts in Gaza, the IDF issued evacuation warnings before striking multi-story residential buildings, giving residents up to an hour to flee. But those in Al-Taj received no warning.
ولو كان في أي شيء زي ما أنت تفضلتي لكان عملوا احتياطهم، كان لبسوا طلعوا، بس لا ما وصلهم أي معلومة نهائي.
International law requires that states do everything possible to warn civilians. The IDF stated the target was a Hamas military tunnel, though it published no evidence for this claim. Lawyers think that the stated target being infrastructure, as opposed to a militant or moving target, may have legal significance.
It's not really controversial that a military tunnel would be a military objective. So under the law of armed conflict, you might say a tunnel could be attacked. But if you attack a tunnel in the knowledge that you're going to destroy a multi-story civilian building and kill all the people inside, then that civilian harm has to be proportionate to the military advantage you would achieve in destroying the tunnel. So a tunnel is not going anywhere. There's absolutely no reason you would not evacuate that building before you launch that attack if you were complying with international humanitarian law, because it requires you to take all feasible precautions to minimize incidental civilian harm. So I think in publishing that video, Israel has actually not left themselves with anywhere to go in relation to claiming that that was a lawful attack.
The Israeli army did not respond to questions about this specific strike, but said, "The IDF regards every loss of civilian life as a profound tragedy and approaches it with the utmost seriousness." It added that the IDF takes all feasible precautions to mitigate the harm to the civilian population, including temporary evacuation effort of the population for their protection. If critical lawyers aim to ultimately use the strike footage against Israel, it appears that Israeli government lawyers may also fear the same outcome. An Air Wars analysis of the frequency with which Israel has been posting strike footage shows a major drop-off in the wake of a case brought against Israel in the International Court of Justice. In the first month of the war, the Israeli Air Force posted more than 600 strike videos on Twitter, with nearly 200 in November and December. In January, South Africa announced it was taking Israel to the ICJ on grounds of genocide. The case relied heavily upon statements made by Israeli officials and the military, including on social media. The ICJ declared that Israel had to take all measures within its power to prevent the killing of Palestinians. In January, the number of posts dropped to just 37, with only 9 posted in February. While the number of allegations of civilian harm reduced slightly over the same period, it does not correlate with the scale of the drop-off in footage. In contrast, as of August 2024, the amount of published footage of strikes against the Hezbollah militant group in Lebanon had not declined to the same extent.
I think it's clear from the numbers that there was a significant drop-off around the time of the ICJ proceedings and the issuing of the Provisional Measures Order. I think it could be related to the fact that Israel might have realized that this footage that they're publishing could have evidential implications for the ICJ proceedings or other criminal proceedings against them.
In most of the 17 civilian harm incidents air wars matched to Israeli strike footage, there was no public evidence of a military target. However, in 5 cases, there was at least one militant killed or military object targeted. One such case was the high-profile killing of Ayman Nofal, a senior Hamas militant reported to have played a key role in the October 7th attacks. On October 17th, the IDF released black and white footage of a number of large explosions in a tightly packed residential neighbourhood. They gave no details of location, but the caption read, "We just eliminated Ayman Nofal, a senior Hamas operative." Air wars geolocated the footage to Al Barej, a densely populated refugee camp in the middle of the Gaza Strip, revealing that the strike was below the area that Israel had warned civilians to evacuate from. Alongside Nofal and at least one other militant, air wars also documented at least 92 civilians killed while sheltering in nearby homes, including 40 children and 28 women. A video from the aftermath shows a crane sifting through rubble in a large crater, suggesting that heavy explosive munitions, potentially 2,000-pound bombs, were used. Advanced militaries, such as Israel's, have sophisticated systems for estimating the number of civilians that may be killed when conducting a strike on a military target. In the event that the number is high enough to be deemed potentially illegal, the strike should be abandoned. The Israeli magazine Plus 972 reported that to kill Nofal, the IDF had authorized the killing of approximately 300 civilians. While Israel has not confirmed this, analysts say that such a high figure would be unheard of in modern warfare.
The highest number in the US military operations in 20 years of military operations that I studied, from all the way from 2001, invasion of Afghanistan, right up to more or less the present day, was 50. So one target, one Hamas militant who we can talk about, and they were willing to consider up to the deaths of 300 innocent civilians who have nothing to do with the war or war efforts in order to kill that person. It's unprecedented, at least on the public record.
Even amongst Israel's closest allies, this acceptance of civilian harm is causing concern, particularly the use of 2,000-pound bombs, some of the largest munitions in modern military arsenals. Such bombs can leave craters more than 40 feet wide, and when used in heavily populated areas, the devastation is catastrophic. While Israel did not confirm the use of such bombs in the killing of Nofal, analysts said it was likely.
I look at that in terms of the evolution of the size of ordnance over the past 20 years for the U.S. over time. And we go through Iraq, Afghanistan, and then Iraq and Syria. We saw a move towards smaller and smaller munitions overall. Not that we didn't use 2,000-pound bombs, but we used many less. Because the goal was to try to find this sweet spot between being effective and reducing the risk of civilians. So to see the IDF use so many 2,000-pound bombs really just surprised me. I thought we had learned this lesson.
Sky News and Air Wars requested an interview with the Israeli military and sent a full list of questions. The IDF declined an interview, but provided a statement saying the focus of the investigation was extremely concerning, as it failed to highlight Hamas's history of operating from civilian neighbourhoods and the brutality of the October 7th attack in Israel. It added that this investigation had intended to present the situation from a specific perspective only, and that many of the accusations and claims presented are baseless and constitute speculation. The IDF said publishing the clips of strikes had shown tens of millions of viewers how terrorist infrastructures are embedded within the civilian population, and that the Israeli military takes all feasible precautions to mitigate the harm to the civilian population. It added that Hamas had taken advantage of safe zones and increased its military presence, making strikes in areas where civilians had evacuated to unavoidable. In these cases, it said, additional precautions are taken to mitigate harm to civilians. With the war in Gaza continuing and a new conflict in Lebanon, the Israeli military continues to use strike footage to shape the narrative of its wars. But this investigation used that same footage to document the full harm of such strikes. The 17 videos that we matched represent just 1% of the strike footage posted by the IDF in Gaza since October 7th. The 3 cases we spotlighted raised serious concerns around Israeli military practice. And in each case, the release of the footage may ultimately make the IDF's justification harder.
It's definitely and absolutely the case that these videos could be used as criminal evidence against Israeli defendants because they show so much. If you think about the elements of the war crimes under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, each individual element needs to be satisfied, and one of the main elements is that the perpetrator directed an attack. So if the perpetrator has published its own video of them directing an attack, then that's one element quite clearly satisfied.
See the full investigation with an interactive map on the Air Wars website.
Our final report on this program features an interview by Owen Jones of The Guardian newspaper in England with Professor Ilan Pappé. Professor Pappé is an Israeli Jewish citizen and one of its most distinguished Israeli historians. He taught for many years, decades actually, in Israel. Today, he researches and writes and teaches at the University of Exeter in Great Britain. He shares his thinking with Owen Jones on the future of the Zionist state in Israel and its settler colonial project, and why he believes we may be seeing the beginning of the end of Zionism and ultimately the transformation of Israel in the aftermath of its genocide in Gaza and the ethnic cleansing campaign there, and of course in the West Bank. Here now is Owen Jones in conversation with Professor Ilan Pappé.
Now, Ilan Pappé, the celebrated Israeli historian, has been long one of the most important voices that we have when it comes to talking about Israel and Palestine. And since the current genocide began, of course, his voice has become even more important than ever. Ilan, it's such an honor to be able to speak to you. Belatedly, I should have done this a long time ago. So I'm glad we're finally communicating on video, and I know my audience will be delighted. Great to speak to you. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you, and thank you so much for having me. Yes, we already planned that long time ago. I'm glad it unfolded eventually.
It's finally happened. So look, let's just actually begin. You know, we're coming to the end now of 2024, and already I remember thinking back to the end of 2023 and thinking about the horror being unleashed against the people of Gaza. And I have to say, if I knew, maybe I wouldn't be shocked, but knew a year later that we'd be discussing still the apparently limitless amount of depravity being unleashed against the people of Gaza, I think I'd been pretty chilled by that, to be honest. And here we are. What have you? I want to ask you, as you know, you're a historian of Israel and Palestine. You know, the historical context is always on your mind. What have you learned since October 2023? Has anything changed in the way you look at this?
Yes, I think in two ways something. I think two aspects became a bit clearer compared to all of our more immediate reactions, and you know, immediate reactions are sometimes a bit amiss because it makes sense. You don't have a perspective, and you don't really know how things develop. But I think now we have a better sense. So one thing that is clear to me, although I already felt this was true even a few months after the 7th of October, that contrary to what some people say, we are not at the beginning of the worst chapter in the history of Palestine and the Palestinians in general, and that of Gaza, of course, in particular. I think we are in the end of that chapter. So I think that this kind of chapter in history that began in the Nakba in 1948, some people rightly would say maybe even earlier, but definitely with the ethnic cleansing of 1948, and the Palestinians call this whole historical chapter the ongoing Nakba, in Arabic, al-Nakba al-Mustamira. This is now reached an apex, undoubtedly, of brutality, of ruthlessness. Ethnic cleansing has turned into genocide. All this is true, but I don't think it's an indication that now a long chapter of destruction is continuing. I really think that this is going to be the beginning of the end of the Zionist colonialist project in Palestine, exactly because it is so ruthless, and because we may elaborate about it a bit later. But that's one kind of analysis that I hesitated to present at the very beginning of the events, and now I'm much more confident about it. The second one, and this is still for me the greatest surprise, if you want, or bewilderment of what happened. I mean, I was not surprised by the level of violence that Hamas performed on the 7th of October, and I'm afraid to say that I was not surprised by the level of the brutality and inhumanity of the Israeli reaction. I was surprised by the total indifference of the West, and in particular of the European West. This is still something that I can provide some partial explanation for why this indifference to the most televised daily genocide we've ever had since the beginning of the end of the Second World War, but I'm still find it beyond comprehension. And that is a process that has, to my mind, impact beyond the question of Gaza or Palestine. I think that impacts the whole issue of the international legal system, the whole issue of what are universal values, and the face of the global South in anything that the global North or global West would put forward as universal principles for running the world, or the order in the world. So I think that's a huge crisis of confidence in international institutions and laws that will have far-reaching impact on all of us, wherever we are, in years to come.
I mean, before I ask you about the first part, which is very, very challenging, I think a lot of people listening to that, particularly in the here and now, would definitely obviously want me to ask you to expand on that, so I will. But before I do, I mean, that second point, you talk about the indifference, because I think, I mean, one thing I've always said is never stop being shocked, even if you understand the dynamics at play. You can understand the dynamics at play, but you should never be numb. But it is about that, which is, I wrote a piece last month where the reason I was really struck by what you said is I tried to put that in words. And I wrote about an apparently invisible fortress, the West's official narrative of Israel's onslaught against Gaza. And what I was trying to look at is, it didn't matter how depraved the atrocity or how overwhelming the evidence or how confessed to the crime. Because, you know, as Raz Segal, the Israeli-American associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide study, puts it, it's very rare for intent actually to be so explicit in these cases. And we've seen that from the very start. But it doesn't matter. The narrative always, the official respectable narrative always survives. When you and I talk about, say, genocide or even war crimes, that almost puts a badge on us as outside of the official respectable narrative. We're extreme, we're radicals, we're dangerous. Do you see what I mean? I'm interested in that. It's almost though there's no level of depravity or confession to depravity. That narrative has remained titanium protected. Nothing seems to budge it in respectable circles.
Yeah. Well, definitely. First of all, it's a fair analysis. I think very few people can argue with you that this is the situation. Now, let's see if we can at least unpack it a bit and see if we can explain it. Maybe it's the historian in me, but I do think there is an historical context for that kind of immunity, that kind of exceptionalism, this kind of gap between the reality, the stark reality on the ground, and the false language and vocabulary used to describe it by people who definitely are not idiots. And one cannot suspect that they are not educated or knowledgeable. And yet they do it maybe even knowingly or maybe unconsciously, I don't know. But I do think it's, especially in Europe, let's put the Americans aside for a moment. It's always a good idea. The Europeans, I think, still treat this whole issue of Israel and Palestine as something that they are part of. And their part in it is not a pleasant one. It's almost like a complicity. Because Zionism, in the end of the day, was as a European solution for European problem. The problem was the way Europe treated its Jews through racism and eventually through genocide. And Zionism, whoever conceived it, provided this easy way out by saying we'll build a European Jewish state at the heart of the Arab world, at the heart of the Muslim world, we'll impose it on the indigenous people of Palestine, and by that we can forget about it. But it seems that it doesn't work, and therefore, I think, in order not to fully appreciate and accept the consequences of this impracticable, immoral project that was sustained through force, not through moral validity, only through force. I think this is where there's still a hope that maybe with language they can kind of launderette the fact that the solution for this European problem was the destruction of Palestine and the Palestinians, not only saving the Jews, but actually destroying another people. And all these European, jugglery, saying it's a small injustice to rectify a bigger one. After the last year, you cannot even say that sentence in any serious manner. And I think that is really the issue here. As long as the Israeli oppression was incremental, here and there justified, or could be covered up as part of self-defense and part of an attempt to sustain a so-called peace process, fine, it worked. But what Israel did in Gaza did not allow any such maneuvering or manipulations. And I think that's it's a partial explanation. I don't think it's the only one, and our Marxist friends rightly would add some economic interest into that. But I think that's a very important psychological infrastructure for that kind of incomprehensible indifference to the suffering of people, which is daily screened on our phones and televisions and so on. Yeah.
I mean, with that, I mean, it's the live streaming, as you said. I mean, obviously, the work of Palestinian journalists who suffered the biggest loss of journalists in recorded history, often alongside their family, their children. But that point about intent, about confession, which I've tried to raise over and over again, but it's almost like it's compartmentalized in a parallel universe, in that you'll get Israeli leaders and officials who say one thing to their local audiences, and then they have their spokespeople who come on Western media outlets to claim they're abiding by international law and not attacking civilians, which they don't say actually if you listen to what they say at home in Hebrew. That's almost that's what's happened. Is almost Western media coverage didn't frame itself around that intent. I often give this hideous example, to be honest, right at the beginning. And this was the Israeli general in charge of Kogat, which is, for those who don't know, the civilian affairs. And he said, Hamas became ISIS and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human animals are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade on Gaza. No electricity, no water, just damage. You wanted hell, you will get hell. That was in a tweet addressed to both Hamas and the residents of Gaza. So there's no pretense there, but that was almost not covered in any single Western media outlet. Do you see what I mean? It's a different universe. That's how it has to, you just have to just pretend it's not being said or done.
Absolutely. Sometimes I think the Israelis treat Hebrew as a secret language, and therefore they allow themselves to say things that they think that afterwards nobody would hear, and it's just for domestic consumption. And then they're really surprised when it turns out that some people who speak Hebrew are horrified by what they said and translate it to other languages. And if you look at the dossier that South Africa presented to the ICJ, it's definitely, I don't think all the people who were in this delegation knows Hebrew, but they have enough people who help them to translate into English these clear manifestation of intent by senior politicians, senior military officers. And if you go even deeper into this, to the orders that were issued by brigade commanders on the eve of the entry to Gaza, you will find this language of an intentional genocide all over it, including references to biblical chapters of genociding the Amalekites and so on. I mean, this is unfortunately, it's a very easy case, I would say, for anyone who takes the most known definition of genocide in the United Nations Charter and checks whether this definition fits the case study of the Israeli intent, rightly as you say, and not only the manifestations or the application of that policy on the ground. I would go even further, and this is something that really we have to take into account, because I do believe, as I said in my first point, that the Israelis are facing really a moment of truth in the whole history of the state. I'll come back to it in a minute. I just want to say that because of that, the only solution that the current Israeli politicians who run the country see, I'm not saying they're not aware of it, but they believe they have a window of opportunity to prevent it. And the only way to prevent it is a total destruction of the Palestinians, not just as people, but as an idea, as a concept. This is why they're taking UNRWA, and this is why they're working now in Syria and other places to kind of create a region, an Arab world that has put the Palestine issue behind it. And I don't think they will succeed, by the way, but I do believe that they can, wreak a lot of havoc and carnage before the failure would become clear.
I mean, that's what I want to ask you about, of course, that very challenging argument that actually this could be the beginning of the end for that Zionist project. And a lot of people will go, I mean, the Israeli state might just respond in a very triumphalist way. Gaza, wiped off the face of the earth. The West Bank, I mean, they've got away with a pogrom there, essentially. Palestinian existence there becoming ever more unbearable. Southern Lebanon, reduced large parts of it to rubble. Hezbollah smashed. Iran hobbled. The obviously now Assad regime, even though in practice it's claimed to be actively support the Palestinian people, we're not. I mean, we can talk about that elsewhere, but I think they're risable. But nonetheless, you can look at that and go, well, actually, things have gone. Yeah, sure. If you don't like mass murder, if you don't like war crimes, boo hoo hoo for you, they might say. But things are going pretty well for us. We're smashing our own enemies. We're smashing our opponents. And now we've got Donald Trump in the White House and a load of pro-Israel zealots. Things are looking pretty good for that project. That's what they would say. What do you think?
Yeah, of course. And there are two immediate points one can respond to. One is there's a huge number of Israelis who don't fancy living in a country that this is its future. This is its vision, to be constantly using military force in order to exist, and military force that has to be more and more brutal and ruthless, not only towards armies, but also towards the population. We don't know the exact number of Israelis who left after 7th of October. Some journalists in Israel put it around 700,000. Others talk about 500,000. It's not only the numbers, it is the kind of characteristic of that group that has left. And it shows you that what they understand, and this is not out of any particular solidarity with the Palestinian suffering. What they understand is that in order to survive in the state, for them, their children and their grandchildren, Israel would always have to have this upper hand in military and security means. Now, for a normal person that would like some, stability in life, some peace in one's own normal life, this is not the place to be in. Undoubtedly, even if, yes, the last 4 weeks were successful from a military point of view, will the next 4 weeks be successful? Would it happen again? And it will happen again, of course, that there will be another Palestinian uprising. There will be another 7th of October. That's very clear. And things can change in the Arab world, but that means your only future is all the time in making sure that your military budget is the most important element in your state's budget. Even economically, not to mention psychologically and mentally. So that's one point. The point that this is not a vision that is shared by a large number of Israelis. I mean, some of them would say there's no other choice, unfortunately, because they can't see any options. But those who can afford it economically, and because they have dual nationalities and so on, and reignite their professions elsewhere, are already leaving. So there's something very hollow here. There's a kind of a social implosion from the inside. There's a domestic price to be paid for this supposedly invincible, the resurgence of the idea of the invincibility of the Israeli army, which I'm still doubting. I mean, they defeated 2 guerrilla movements. In the end of the day, that's what they did. Guerrilla movements who had no air force, had no tanks, and so on. So to put it in perspective, it's quite important as well. But the second point is also very, very, very important. This kind of vision from an economic point of view would need a very strong global alliance led by the United States that would not only support Israel diplomatically and politically, but materially. We already know the expenditure that this success has produced beyond anything Israel has ever spent on military issues. And you think about even someone like Donald Trump and any other isolationist politician that would come from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. I wonder whether in 5, 6, 7 years they would regard Israel as such an asset, when they will have to pay for all of this, because the Israelis don't have that many resources to pay for themselves. So there are these kinds of immediate responses, but there's something more profound going on here. Unless you believe that the world cannot change, then yes, maybe it's too early to say it's the beginning of the end. But if you have even a modicum of belief that the political system we live in, whether it's in Britain or in Israel or in the United States or in Turkey, it doesn't matter. But if you even have a modicum of belief that the current political situation or constellation is not forever, you don't take a determinist view, and you think about more positive alternatives to the existing political system, any positive alternative, even a slight move towards such an alternative model, will bring the end of the Zionist project closer. Because the way you can sustain Israel is only in a world that is ruled by populist leaders, right-wing neo-fascist parties, dictators in the Arab world, a democratic Arab world, a more democratic and liberal even, West and global South would not tolerate the kind of state that Israel has become.
I mean, I totally take your point about, the illusion of every age is that it will last forever. And I agree with you. But I guess, in the here and now, one might look at the position Israel's in. I mean, you say, for example, the idea, another October 7th could happen. But I mean, some might go, well, there was only one 7th of October that ever happened in the history of Israel. And that was because the Israeli military, they saw Gaza as a sealed tomb from which nobody would ever emerge anyway. And they didn't have their military in place to prevent what happened, including, of course, the killing of Israeli civilians, but that they wouldn't make that mistake ever again. I mean, what do you say? They can just basically insulate Israel from anything. And, if there's any attack on them, they just wipe out southern Lebanon.
They were surprised when the first Intifada broke out. They were surprised when the second one broke out. Israel needs to employ, I don't know if any other country, maybe some, like North Korea is a good example for that. Israel needs to employ, I think even North Korea is not as bad in that respect. Israel needs to employ hundreds of thousands of its own people to police the Palestinians so that the Palestinians would reconcile with living in mega prisons such as West Bank or in a ghetto like Gaza or in apartheid state which is experienced by the Palestinian citizens of Israel. How long can they really do this? I mean, how much is it really a secure policy for the future if you have millions of people now reaching a number that is equal to your own citizens who are not willing to go away, are resisting, are resilient, and are not going to give up? Not to mention the millions of the same people and nation who are on Israel borders, and the fact that so many people in the civil society in the Arab world and the Muslim world support them. I mean, you have to take into account this constellation. Yes, admittedly, to simplify it, we can say there's a global Israel and global Palestine. So yes, right now, global Israel, which is made of Israel supporters, mostly populist leaders, right-wing governments, maybe even industrial military complexes and multinational corporations. Fine. Very, very powerful alliance. I don't doubt it. But there's a global Palestine, the one that is supported by so many people in civil societies, which the global South, look at the position of some of the Latin American countries. Look at the changes in some countries like Estonia and so on. This is an incremental process of isolating Israel, of turning it into a rogue state. I know people are very unhappy in Palestine about the ICJ and the ICC. And I can see why, because it was their rulings have not translated yet into an effective action. But I think is a very fundamental change in the way the world relates to Israel and Palestine. The ICC and ICJ are not just an organic part of the civil society. They're kind of the medium between the civil society and the corridors of power. And I think that is very significant in the long run. So, we can add to this the attitude of the young Jewish generation, including in the United States. So many Jews do not want to be associated with Israel. Now, we can all say that doesn't matter. They don't have brigades. They don't have political power. They don't have a clout in the Congress and so on. But this is a still picture, what we're talking about. We're not talking about the video here. The video shows the changes. Very slow, too slow for the people of Gaza. And I'm afraid maybe even too slow for the people of the West Bank if we are right in our apprehension that Israel would move with the same model to the West Bank. I fully agree. But in the long run, I see this as this ruthless Israel as burying its own hole in terms of international standing, legitimacy, and you can buy the Arab regimes, but you cannot buy the Arab people. And Israel is still a minority in the Arab world. I mean, Israel is not part of Europe. It wants to be maybe part of Europe, but it is in the heart of the Arab world and the Muslim world that since the 2011 is undergoing its own revolution. There is now counter-revolution, but this is not over. And this whole project does not fit the aspiration of people in this part of the world and other parts of the world for a different world. And if you are in that situation, only force and more force would sustain you. And I wonder from my historical experience whether this is a long-term business.
Well, I suppose, yeah, with that cap on, the historical context cap on, in terms of looking as, a guide, using that as the guide for the future, because that point you made about, essentially Israel's position is the Palestinian population represent an existential problem and they work backwards from that, which is why you talk about an idea. That's why you often have cheerleaders to the Israeli state saying there's no such thing as the Palestinians. That's been a perennial claim because their fear is the very identity, the sense of identity that Palestinians have poses an existential threat to the Israeli project. And as you know, the attack on UNRWA, the refugee agency for Palestinians, is they hate that because it's this idea, it sustains the idea that Palestinians are refugees who've been kicked from those. But couldn't they just start, when Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister talks about thinning out Gaza's population by half in 2 years. Under Trump, my point is, could they just not do that? They could just gradually people through death, through what they call voluntary migration. You make Gaza uninhabitable, obviously, which they have, and then you just, under humanitarian garbs, you just start exporting the population. Maybe do a deal with Sisi in Egypt of some description. He's a Western-backed dictator. In the West Bank, just gradually, again, asphyxiate Palestinian existence so people just leave. Do you see what I mean? I mean, couldn't they just get away with just getting rid of the Palestinian population from Gaza and the West Bank over a period of time?
They could get away in the short run, but they cannot get away in the long run. I don't want to mention names, but there were other regimes in history that 2 or 3 years after they came into power, the world seemed to be unable to stop them from any plans, whether it was occupying other nations, whether it was genociding them, and so on. And it seemed like nobody would ever be able to stop them. 5, 6 years later, they were stopped eventually. So, yes, I mean, they could do all these things, and unfortunately, they want to do all these things. And of course, I'm not just an historian, I'm also an activist. So I'm not just an onlooker and an analyst. I'm also part of a movement that will do all they can to stop it. But beyond that, let's say that we unfortunately are not that powerful right now to stop it, which is an unfortunate possibility. Nonetheless, the success of that is, to me, from an historical perspective, another factor that would bring it down. I think that you have to look at the more liberal forces that were part of this global Israel alliance. What they benefited from was the kind of double talk that you referred to before, that the Israelis were kind of conveying. We are actually the only democracy in the Middle East. We are part of the social democratic world, in fact, even more than just the democratic world. Yes, we have enemies, we have problems, but all in all, this is our aspiration is for peace and so on. This discourse has disappeared from the Israeli political scene. So I think it would be more and more difficult for the politicians in the West that are not populist, that are not part of the fascist neo-right, to continue and do it. They still do it. There's a strong lobby. There is still fear and timidity because politicians, especially of this generation, are thinking of the next election and not of any moral values. But here and there, we can see the signs that the lobby was successfully destroying, but these signs will increase, like someone like Corbyn, someone like Bernie Sanders. I mean, these are not going to be exceptions of the rule that are going to disappear. We won't hear about them again. These are just, trailblazers. This is going to change, and therefore I'm looking. I wish I had the formula how to narrow the gap between the very slow process that I think is positive as far as the Palestinians is concerned, regionally and globally, and the very quick process of destruction on the ground. And how to narrow the gap is our biggest mission in this lifetime, for sure, because you're absolutely right in the way you analyze the Israeli intentions and possibilities under Trump. In fact, by the way, not only under Trump, but don't just give it to Trump.
Of course. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
There are other political forces in the globe that help it. But,
of course.
But the Palestinians are not alone. That is important. These global forces are not only representing, carte blanche for Israel to do what it wants. They also represent injustices in many other fields, including in their own countries. So there is a potential for a much stronger alliance that Palestine just epitomizes it, but it's not alone.
Yeah, because you alluded to that, the Israeli propaganda kind of presentation of the only democracy in the Middle East. And, I interviewed Ofer Kasif, who is a very courageous Jewish Israeli politician. And Hadash, of course, I know you've been involved in, you've stood for election under the Hadash banner. They're the leftist alliance of Jewish and Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. But I mean, I want to run this by, in terms of where Israel is heading, and see what you think about this, because he was talking about fascism. He just talked about, fascism. He fears for his life. He says, he talks about the possibility of having to flee Israel. That's what he talked about with me.
Mhm.
But I wonder, in terms of this kind of, if this is almost what you're alluding to, and see if this analogy works at all. Because in climate science, there's this idea of a hothouse effect, where temperature rises, get to a point where it becomes exponential. There's a theory that's what happened to Venus. Venus is this hot house where it's, impossibly hot. The atmosphere is so thick. Now, I'm wondering if that's the process, the analogous process with the Israeli state, that you get this process of radicalization where, it gets more and more, the internal dynamic with nothing to stop it, radicalizes and radicalizes and radicalizes it until it consumes the whole project, and that it collapses and becomes completely and utterly unsustainable. I mean, is that what it is? Is there a hothouse effect of fascist radicalization happening in Israel at the moment?
Yes, and I think it is, and like Ofer, I also fear for my life, but I'm 70 years old, so I'm going to stay where I want to stay. But I would say that this is exactly what characterizes such a fascist regime in the making, or maybe is already there, as Ofer claims, that everybody becomes an enemy, not just the Palestinians. The secular Jews become the enemy. The Reform Jews become the enemy. I mean, they're going to swallow and consume everyone, apart from those who they think are totally supporting their messianic neo-Zionist vision of a fascist Israel that is feared by its neighbors and has expunged the whole Palestinian issue out of history and out of geography. And this is not going to work. This is not going to work because there is a limit to how far you can go, especially with the origins of this project, that at least its founders believe that material help is not enough, that you need moral legitimacy for its existence. Now, this moral legitimacy has been seriously eroded. These particular politicians and leaders do not think moral legitimacy, international moral legitimacy, is important anymore. That is true, and that's why they have no inhibitions in what they're going to do. I'm not sure that this is the zeitgeist that we live in, that really you can totally ignore that kind of thing. After all, there are other rogue states in the world, and we tend to forget that some of these rogue states do suffer from sanctions, do suffer from isolation, we are not sure that this is going to be something sustainable, just because there is this belief that you don't care about the moral legitimacy, or because there are, as we talked before, this kind of political movements and leaders in the world who don't care about moral validity as well. I do agree that they exist, and they are probably preventing us from finishing this project sooner rather than later. But in the end of the world, I do believe and I feel connected to so many movements of change in the world, especially among the younger generation, that I refuse to accept that the current situation is fatalistic, that there's nothing we can do.
That's our report. Thank you, as always, for being with us. It is day 444 of Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, 45,317 Palestinians have been killed to date. 107,713 have been wounded or injured, many grievously. And there are at least 11,000 Palestinians in Gaza who are reported missing, buried under the rubble. There is no end in sight yet to the war. Again, thank you for watching, and we will see you further down the road.